Picture this person for a moment. It's 5:17 in the morning. The city outside is still dark, still quiet, still in the middle of a dream it hasn't finished yet. But they are already awake, already at the window, already filming. The matcha is the right shade of green. The journal is open to a clean page. The light, 12 minutes were spent adjusting the light. And when they press record, the voice comes out soft and deliberate, like someone who has practiced being at peace so many times that it no longer requires effort. They say, "Today is going to be intentional." They mean it. They always mean it. Somewhere right now, several 100,000 people are watching them mean it. Sociologist Erving Goffman spent much of his career studying something we all do, but almost never examine directly: the performance of everyday life. In his 1959 work on impression management, he described every social interaction as a kind of theater. There's a front stage, the version of yourself you curate for an audience, and there's a backstage, where you eat the food that didn't photograph well, where you cancel plans because your body has run out of whatever resource it pretends to have in unlimited supply, where you sit on the bathroom floor at 11 p.m., not being intentional about anything. Goffman was describing the 1950s. He had no idea he was writing a prophecy. What the wellness aesthetic has done is something more extreme than anything Goffman imagined. It has not simply moved the front stage online. It has convinced an entire generation that the backstage is a character flaw. That if the unfilmed version of you exists, tired, ambivalent, craving something fried and uncomplicated, that version is a problem to be solved, not a self to be inhabited. And here is where the science starts to become uncomfortable. Leon Festinger proposed social comparison theory in 1954. The core idea is almost insultingly simple. Human beings evaluate themselves by comparing themselves to others. We can't stop doing this. It is not a moral failure or a weakness of character. It is how the brain calculates its own position in the social world. A calculation it has been running since long before there were algorithms to feed it material. But Festinger was working in a world where social comparison happened in offices and neighborhoods and dinner parties. The sample size was manageable. The data points were human-scaled. Then, we handed the brain a feed that refreshes every 12 seconds. A feed populated not by the actual lives of people we know, but by the most curated 15-second clips of the most curated days of strangers who have every incentive to make those clips look like evidence of a life that is working. The brain did not evolve a setting for this. It just runs the same ancient calculation. Where am I relative to them? Over and over, on an input stream that was never designed to be compared to a real human life in the first place. And one of the things it concludes, with increasing frequency, is they are doing something right that you are doing wrong. They woke up earlier. They moved their body with more discipline. They processed their emotional landscape with more sophistication and then photographed it beautifully. You should be more like that. You should do more of that. Now hold that thought, because the next piece matters. In 1998, social psychologist Roy Baumeister published what would become one of the most replicated and later contested findings in modern psychology. He called it ego depletion. The basic claim: self-control is not a character trait, it is a resource. and like any resource, it can run out. The original research used chocolate and radishes, which is a very unglamorous way to stumble onto something with enormous implications. Participants who had spent energy resisting chocolate gave up on unsolvable puzzles significantly faster than those who hadn't. Something was being spent. Something finite was being drawn down. Later research has complicated this picture. The mechanism is not a simple glucose tank, but the underlying principle that sustained self-monitoring and self-regulation consumes something real, something that depletes, that has held across decades of subsequent work. Think about what that means for someone who wakes up and immediately begins performing, who structures the first 45 minutes of every morning as a sequence of observable, documentable, audience-ready behaviors, who monitors not just what they do but how it looks, who maintains in the background of every decision a running process. Would this be consistent with the person I have told everyone I am? They haven't even had breakfast, and they have already spent from a budget that was never infinite to begin with. Neuroscientist Lisa Feldman Barrett has a framework that makes this even more concrete. She describes the brain as constantly managing what she calls the body budget, a biological accounting system that tracks energy expenditure and works to keep the organism solvent. Sleep, food, movement, rest. These are deposits. Sustained stress, social performance, emotional suppression. These are withdrawals. The body budget is not metaphorical. It is the literal predictive mechanism by which your brain regulates your heart rate, your immune function, your hormonal systems, your capacity to think clearly and feel things accurately. Here is the part that matters. The brain cannot distinguish between the stress of a genuine threat and the stress of maintaining a persona. Both show up as withdrawals. Both cost something real. So when they post the morning routine and the comments fill up with heart emojis and the number ticks up, the body budget is not being replenished by the validation. The body budget is being drained by the performance required to earn it, and then drained again by the performance of the next day, and the day after that. They call it discipline. Their nervous system calls it debt. This is where Carl Jung becomes relevant, and not in the watered-down pop psychology version that appears on quote cards. Jung identified what he called the persona, the mask we construct for social life. Not a deception exactly, more like a necessary adaptation. The face we train to face the world, calibrated to what the world rewards. The persona is not inherently a problem. It becomes one when it is the only face we know. Because everything the persona excludes doesn't disappear. It goes somewhere. Jung called that place the shadow. The repository of everything we have decided is unacceptable, unlovable, unpostable. The anger, the ambivalence, the days when nothing feels intentional and the matcha just tastes like grass, and you don't actually want to be grateful for anything. The shadow is not evil. Jung was very clear about this, and almost everyone who quotes him gets it wrong. The shadow is simply the part of the self that the persona cannot afford to acknowledge. And here is what Jung observed about people who develop an especially polished, especially rigid persona. The shadow grows in proportion. The more relentlessly the front is maintained, the more pressure accumulates behind it. This is not philosophy. This is something you can watch happen in real time. The clean eating aesthetic tips into orthorexia. The productivity ritual becomes the thing that consumes all the energy it was meant to generate. The healing journey, this is the most painful one, becomes its own form of compulsion, a project with no endpoint and no rest days, where not healing is a moral failure rather than a Tuesday. And then the self-guilt arrives, not gently, like a supervisor who was already disappointed before you walked into the room. You slept until 7:30. You ate something that wasn't photographable. You felt something that wasn't easily categorized as a growth opportunity. You broke character. And the part of you that has spent months constructing that character does not respond with compassion. It responds with a performance review. There is a clinical concept worth sitting with here: alexithymia. Literally, no words for feelings. It describes a state where someone has lost, or never developed, the capacity to identify and name their own emotional experience. They know something is happening internally. They cannot access what it is. Researchers have found correlations between alexithymia and sustained emotional suppression. When you spend long enough redirecting, reframing, and re-narrativizing every internal state into something more presentable, more consistent with the story you are telling, the direct line between the feeling and its recognition starts to degrade. You do not end up more in control of your emotions. You end up more estranged from them. And this is the deepest cruelty of the performance. It promises self-knowledge and delivers self-alienation instead. It promises healing and produces a specific kind of numbness that is very good at looking like peace. Now, we need to turn the mirror, because this essay would be easier and less honest if the performative self were someone else. If it were a cautionary tale about weak people seduced by vanity. If the audience were watching from a safe distance. They are not someone else. They are what happens when the instinct to improve yourself, which is genuine, which is human, which is not the problem, gets routed through an infrastructure that was designed to monetize attention, not to support growth. They are what happens when the language of therapy and healing and self-care gets captured by aesthetics. When doing the work becomes a content category. When vulnerability itself becomes a performance genre. The self-help industrial complex is worth noting here. Billions of dollars are made annually by selling people the feeling that they are in the process of becoming who they should be, not by helping them arrive. Arrival would end the revenue stream by keeping them perpetually in transit, always optimizing, always one habit stack away from the version of themselves that would finally deserve rest. They bought the journals, they downloaded the apps, they learned the vocabulary, they built the routine, and they are exhausted in a way they do not have words for yet. Partly because they have been so thoroughly trained to reframe exhaustion as data for improvement, rather than as a message worth receiving on its own terms. This is not a story about one demographic. It is not about one gender, one generation, one corner of the internet. The architecture is the same whether the aesthetic is morning routines and matcha, or gym PRS and cold plunges, or minimalist productivity systems and stoic journaling. The specific content changes, the underlying structure does not. Perform growth, document growth, seek validation for growth. Repeat until the performance becomes indistinguishable from the thing it was meant to produce. Kristin Neff has spent 2 decades studying self-compassion, not as a soft concept, not as the self-help industry's version of it, but as a measurable psychological construct with neurological correlates. Her research at the University of Texas has documented something counterintuitive. Self-compassion is not associated with complacency or reduced motivation. It is associated with greater emotional resilience, more accurate self-assessment, and, here is the important one, lower levels of anxiety and depression than self-criticism. More specifically, the neural pathways activated when you receive compassion from another person are the same pathways activated when you offer it to yourself. The brain does not fully distinguish between the two. Kindness directed inward has real, measurable biological effects, effects that show up on scans, in cortisol levels, in immune function. This is not self-indulgence. This is biology being more sophisticated than the culture that keeps trying to override it. What the wellness performance offers instead of self-compassion is what Neff would call contingent self-worth, value that is conditional on performance, perpetually at risk of being revoked, never quite secured no matter how many mornings begin correctly. And contingent self-worth, the research is clear, does not build psychological stability. It builds vigilance. Hypervigilance, the constant monitoring of whether you are still meeting the standard that earns you permission to be okay. You stepped outside the pressure of external performance metrics, and then you rebuilt a smaller, more intimate version of that same architecture inside your own head and hired yourself as both the manager and the employee, and you never gave yourself a weekend. Brené Brown's research on vulnerability adds one more layer. Her work suggests that the capacity to tolerate imperfection, to allow the messy, unoptimized, unfilmed version of your life to simply exist, is not a deficit. It is a prerequisite for genuine connection, genuine creativity, and what she calls wholehearted living. Not because difficulty is ennobling, but because authenticity requires the full range. You cannot genuinely connect over curated content. You can only broadcast it. And somewhere in the gap between broadcasting and connecting, the very thing the performance was supposed to generate, the sense of being seen, of mattering, of belonging to something real, keeps receding. The audience grows. The loneliness does too. Think about an experiment you can run later when the stakes are lower. Do the thing with no one watching. Sit with a book that no one will see you reading. Move your body in a way that will not be documented. Make the food that actually sounds good to you, rather than the food that photographs as evidence of a certain kind of person. Sit in the quiet for 15 minutes and do not try to extract a lesson from it. And pay attention, not to whether it feels good, because it might feel deeply uncomfortable. Pay attention to whether it feels like you, whether the person doing these things in the dark, with no audience and no documentation, is someone you recognize, someone you have met before, someone you are willing to be. Because that question cuts closer to the truth than any morning routine ever could. Psychological integrity, the real kind, not the performed kind, does not come from eliminating the dark frequencies. It comes from the capacity to contain them, to let a low-energy day be a low-energy day without extracting a narrative from it. To cry when the nervous system needs to discharge without immediately converting that into content about the importance of emotional processing. To eat the street food without the caption about balance. The shadow does not need to be posted. It needs to be inhabited. This does not mean abandoning growth. It does not mean giving up the practices that genuinely serve you. It means holding them differently. Growth that requires an audience to sustain it is not growth. It is theater that has convinced itself it is growth. And the way to tell the difference is almost disturbingly simple. Take away the audience and see what remains. If the stillness is still there when no one is watching, if the gratitude is still there, the curiosity, the care for your own life, then you have something real. Then the practice belongs to you rather than to the performance. But if removing the audience removes the motivation, if the morning feels empty without the documentation, if the meal loses its meaning without being shared, if the quiet sits wrong because no one knows you are sitting in it, then something worth examining is happening. Not condemning, examining. Because that is not a moral failure. That is information. The body budget is telling you what the persona has been refusing to hear, that the energy has been flowing in the wrong direction for a while, that something real is waiting behind the performance, and it has been waiting patiently, and it is not angry, and it is not a problem. It is just you, the backstage version, the one who doesn't know their angles, the one who sometimes feels nothing in particular, and sometimes feels everything at once, and who has never, not once, needed to be healed of either. The question that lingers, and this is where the essay has to stay honest, which means it cannot give you a clean resolution, is what it would mean to build a life that doesn't require a front stage, not to abandon all curation, not to weaponize rawness as its own aesthetic, which is simply a different kind of performance, but to build something smaller and sturdier, something that doesn't depend on an audience to remain coherent, something that could survive the silence. Jung believed the process of individuation, of becoming fully and genuinely yourself, required integrating the shadow rather than transcending it, not merging with the darkness, not wallowing, integrating, acknowledging that the full self contains things the persona would never post, and that those things are not less real for being unposted, and that a life built entirely around the persona is a life in which the most important parts of you never get to live. They are still at the window. The video is still rolling. The comments are still coming in. And somewhere beneath the performance, beneath the routine and the journal and the carefully calibrated light, something is waiting. It has been waiting for a long time. The question is not whether it's there. The question is what you're willing to do when you finally decide to let it speak.